Anzac Day, the day when all Australians stop in their tracks to remember war. We're one of the only countries in the world which has a war memorial in just about every city or town. So why is our remembrance so strong? Well, Anzac Day falls on April the 25th, and that's the day that Australian and New Zealand troops first joined in World War I. And since then, we've put 70 years, a Second World War, and a nuclear arms race between us. So what have we learnt from World War I?
New weapons, such as the machine gun, were used for the first time for an artillery barrage that was unrelenting. The destruction and the loss of lives was massive.
Well, the war was a tragedy, a waste of lives that should never have happened. It started almost by accident, but by the time it had finished, most of Europe and many other countries in the world had been dragged into it. So let's go now to Europe to try to see how this war started. Well, this is the map of Europe as it looked in 1914 at the height of the empire building. European countries were competing for overseas lands. The British, the German, the Austrian, the Russian, and the Turkish empires were particularly powerful, and they were all looking very jealously at each other's territories and at their weapons.
Factories all over Europe were churning out munitions. Rivalry in arms build-up was matched by rivalry for the biggest and most powerful navies. Countries such as Russia took great national pride in their military power. When the world leaders, such as the German Kaiser, appeared in public, it was often in military uniform, surrounded by high-ranking military officials. King George of England, shown here, is about to make an inspection of British troops. But the build-up of the army was not just happening in England. It was a game that the whole of Europe was playing.
As the European arms race escalated, alliances were being formed, dividing Europe here approximately into two power blocks. Britain, France, and Russia, which you can see in the beige colour, had formed an alliance back in 1907. Germany, Austria, Hungary, and originally Italy also had formed an alliance. Now, Turkey, over here, used to have control of this area here called the Balkans. Now, as Turkey's empire declined, Russia and Austria competed for control of this area. And Serbia, which is right down here and part of Yugoslavia today, was regarded by Austria as a threat. The man who would have become the next king of Austria, Archduke Ferdinand, was visiting Serbia with his wife. While he was in Sarajevo, a rebel student shot and killed the couple while they were travelling in his car. It was like lighting a match in dry straw. Now, Austria blamed Serbia and made provocative demands threatening war. So Serbia here had been backed into a corner. So she turned to Russia, who had already promised her aid if she was attacked. So when Austria replied by declaring war on Serbia, Russian troops over here prepared for war by moving troops towards Serbia. Now, Germany, back here, who was Austria's ally, feared Russia's threat to attack and demanded that Russia withdraw her troops. When Russia refused, Germany declared war. But Germany was worried that an attack on Russia across here would mean an attack on them, the Germans, by France. And they certainly didn't want to be attacked from two sides at once. So they thought that since the Russians would be fairly slow in bringing up their troops, there was time to quickly eliminate the French. So following a plan which had been drawn up many years before, Germany attacked France through Belgium. And it was at this stage that Britain joined in. So whether it was caused by a series of blunders or by military ambitions or was simply caused by the climate of rivalry, the fact remains that Europe had caught fire and was at war. So How then did the tentacles of a European war spread across to Australia?
At the time, Australia had strong ties with Britain. Newspapers were saying things like,
"The British Empire is our family circle, and we cannot live without it. Who lives if England dies?"
even before the war started, Australia had promised.
"To defend England to our last man and our last shilling."
Volunteers rushed to enlist and to swear allegiance to Britain. As one soldier to enlist wrote,
"I'm going to have a try for the war. They want all they can get, and I think it's the greatest opportunity for a chap to make a man of himself."
Training took place at home. Most men thought going off to war was a great adventure, a chance to be a hero.
I'm so excited. I'm itching to get a dig at a few Germans.
Enlistment posters advertised,
"Free trip to Europe, full of adventure and interest."
Posters such as these were put out to encourage men to volunteer.
"I've enlisted. I believe it's every fella's duty."
Propaganda at the cinemas played on the strong anti-German feeling of the time. Some men enlisted out of hatred for the Germans.
"I'm very keen to get to grips with those inhuman brutes."
Films of the day, such as this one, portrayed people encouraging their friends to enlist. It was common to talk of doing one's duty, answering the call. While there were many people who disagreed with the war, in this film, the scrawny man who tears down the enlistment poster is portrayed as a traitor and a villain. Families were proud to have their sons enlist. Every Australian woman's heart is thrilling with pride, with exultation. Boys, you have honoured our land.
If I had stayed at home, I would never have been able to hold my head up and look any decent girl in the face.
We think you ought to go, for your king and your country both need you so. We shall want you and miss you, but with all our might and main, we shall cheer you, thank you, kiss you when you come back again.
Now, while Australia was preparing to fight, war in Europe was spreading. Up till the outbreak of war, Turkey, over here, had been wooed by both sides as an ally. But when war broke out, she was forced into a decision. And while she'd been toying with joining Russia and Britain, the Germans had a very strong influence on the Turkish leaders, the young Turks. So Turkey eventually found herself on the opposing side to Britain, who was angling for control of the only reliable water connection to Russia, the Straits of the Dardanelles, right here. Now, possession of the Dardanelles here would enable Britain to send supplies to Russia by sea from Britain, around Spain, up through the Mediterranean, through the Dardanelles, and on to Russia.
These straits were very narrow and were well protected by forts. Because they were in such a strategic position, the straits have been subject to attack over the centuries. With this long history of attack, the Turks had a strong warrior tradition shown in these sword dances. The Turks had earned a reputation throughout Europe as tough fighters. The lifestyle in Turkey at the outbreak of war was peaceful and simple. Turkey had not yet caught up with the industrialization of Europe. Most of the population lived on the land, making a living by farming and selling produce. So when Turkey found herself at war, there were three groups of people who formed her defence force. The first group were volunteers from the towns and farm areas. The regular army formed the main body of Turkey's defence. And the third group to join Turkey's defence force were the hills people, a tough people used to the rugged terrain. Meanwhile, off the shores of the Gallipoli Peninsula, the Allied battle fleet was assembling. Mustafa Kemal, who was later to become Turkey's most famous general and the father of modern Turkey, prepared for defence.
The first day we landed, we ran into a real live hell. Shrapnel bullets, machine guns all over the place. With much swearing and cheering, we charged up a hill so steep in places we could only just scramble. No firing, all bayonet work. Clean over a machine gun we went. Men dropped all round me. It was mad, wild, thrilling. Not till I was near the top of the hill did I realise that, in the excitement, I hadn't even drawn my revolver.
The Turkish opposition was strong. Casualties on both sides were heavy. After an intense battle, both sides settled into trench warfare. In the next 8 months at Gallipoli, the Allied troops were to advance no further than they were now.
You can imagine what it was like. Really too awful to write about. All your pals that have been with you for months and months, blown and shot out of all recognition.
Built at the foot of these hills, these piers were the only access for supplies and water. Supplies had to be dragged up the steep slopes. On the other side of the hills, the Turks were able to bring in their supplies over land. Everyone did what they could to support the soldiers in the trenches. The people were behind the army. In some places, they helped by making ammunition by hand. Meanwhile, the Australians made bombs out of anything they could lay their hands on. Old jam tins, biscuit boxes. Back at home, women knitted socks for the soldiers, not knowing what conditions were really like in the trenches. The trenches were very narrow. The front line trenches were often so close to Turkish trenches, such as these, that on occasions gifts were exchanged. Both sides shared the same horrors of living in the trenches, with the flies, lice, heat, and often the stench of unburied bodies. No one could ever be sure how long they were going to live.
It's quite common for men to go mad here. The strain on the nerves is so severe. The roar of the guns, the shrieks of your own artillery, and the clatter of rifle fire is enough to drive a fellow mad.
For relief from the boredom and strains of the trenches, many went swimming. Even the Turkish prisoners were given a go. Both sides took prisoners. This is one of the Turkish hospitals where British prisoners are being given medical treatment. When he used a donkey to carry wounded men to hospital, Simpson typified the courage of the Australians under fire. He too became a casualty when he was shot through the heart. The Anzacs became known for their courage and their rough sense of humour.
The electric elevator will not be working up the gullies for a while. Some cook stole the current to make a pudding. Will the girl who smiled at William Tonkin's last Boxing Day please write to him at once?
Meanwhile, back home, people waited anxiously for news from the front. The release of the first casualty lists left Australia shocked, and the lists grew. The losses were enormous. Winter came to Gallipoli. Men suffered frostbite, pneumonia, and nearly 16,000 had to be evacuated. It was the last straw. Lord Kitchener came from London and agreed to evacuation. Stores had to be thrown out. Everything was done to deceive the Turks. The brilliant plans for evacuation were drawn up by a Victorian, Lieutenant Colonel White. The Australians withdrew, suffering only 2 casualties, but many had been left behind. Today there is no thundering of guns or shelling. The hills, once covered in trenches, are green again, and the bay is quiet. And today the Turks tend the graves of those who died at Gallipoli.
Well, the battle at Gallipoli had been a failure. Australians, like the rest of the world, were beginning to be shocked by the realities of war. And the story of Gallipoli is the story of just one of the tragedies of World War I. And for the Australians, it was just the beginning. One of the hardest lessons that the men who fought at Gallipoli had to face was that the war was to go on and on for another 3.5 years. Australia was to lose 7.5 times as many men in France and the Sinai deserts as those she lost at Gallipoli.
The Anzac troops fought in the Sinai deserts in a long and hard campaign against the Turks. It was the last time the light horse cavalry was used in the war. Casualties here were heavy, but not as heavy as they were in France, where nearly 180,000 Australians were killed or wounded. From the trenches, men were given the order to advance.
For the first minute, I felt sick. Then as steady as a rock. I was right in the line of fire, and the shells came straight from my bay. Some of the fellows' nerves gave way, and they became gibbering idiots. God, it was little wonder. Well, fighting here is just simply massacre. What we went through was hell itself. I'm not going to tell a lie and say I wasn't afraid, because I was. And who wouldn't be, with death grinning at you from all round and hellish shells shrieking through the air and shrapnel dealing death all round? I don't know how I stood it for so long without breaking.
In an attempt to break the stalemate of trench warfare, the British developed tanks. The war had devastated large parts of France. Then, with the rain, came mud. The country had been turned into a barren quagmire.
I'm on my way to hospital, suffering from trench feet, due to being in water up to my knees for 72 hours without a break. On several occasions, we've had to dig people out. One man was up to his shoulders for 4 hours, and another up to his waist for 1. Mud from the top of our heads to the bottom of our boots, drenched to the very skin. Your thoughts must be alone for the men perishing in the front line. No songs are sung and no poetry written about fatigue parties. If anyone had told me before I enlisted what I had to go through, I would have thought I never could have gone through it.
The impact of the Anzac troops put Australia on the map for the first time in the eyes of the rest of the world. Australia was now regarded as a nation in its own right, but the cost was enormous. No one can ever be said to win in war. Anzac Day has become a day of remembrance for all wars and for all people and all countries who've fought in them. And it's a day when people remember the selflessness of the individuals, their courage and their suffering, the way they were prepared to even die for others. But it's also become a time to question why, in the first place, they were called upon to do this.
Oh, we don't want to lose. we think you ought to go, for your king